It's a pleasure to introduce you to my colleague, Lawrence Husick. He's a man of many hats. He's a patent lawyer by day. He's an inventor, a holder of several patents. He's a high-tech entrepreneur. He's a high school debating coach. He's the co-chairman of our Center for the Study of Terrorism, where he concentrates on technology and the leverage that it produces. And he also is the co-director of our program on teaching innovation, the history of innovation. And he's a big proponent that in teaching innovation, the most important thing we could teach our students is that it's okay to fail. But I'll let him expound on that at his leisure. Anyway, we've asked him to speak today about Stuxnet and other covert responses to the Iranian nuclear program. Oh, the other hat he wears, judging by the map he's put up on the board there, is he thinks he's also Jon Stewart. But please welcome Lawrence Husick.
Thank you, Alan, and good morning. No, I don't think I'm Jon Stewart. I like Jon Stewart. I just think that this is symptomatic and emblematic of a lot of our problem in the United States. I think most of you would agree that if you, on the first day of whatever class you teach, took an unlabeled map of the Middle East and asked your students to please label Iran, a great many of them would fail. This is proof that they're not alone. So, my topic today is trying to understand the covert responses to the Iranian nuclear program, and moreover, understanding the Iranian nuclear program as it has developed and as it is likely to develop. And that's become an issue in this presidential campaign, I think an outsized one. It seems to be part of this obsession with Iran that we heard about so much yesterday. And if your students think that studying world affairs and current events and the history of the Middle East is not the most exciting thing they do in the course of their day, I hope that the next 45 minutes will enable you to change their minds, because this can be, in very short terms, the most exciting lesson you teach all year. So let's get started. Here are a few headlines that have been in the news in the last 18 months. Starting with this strange one: mystery surrounds the cyber missile that crippled Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. A cyber missile. This is an indication that the press simply didn't know how to talk about the subject 18 months ago. And then we learned about programmers being assassinated. Whoever thought that being a computer programmer was a dangerous occupation? And we learned that Western powers, quote unquote, in Israel carried out this attack, and that there was likely to be a boomerang. And then we found out that our own Pentagon was thinking about this, and that by launching a computer virus, you could be actively engaging in warfare. And then we understood that our Pentagon didn't understand what that meant. And finally, we understood that President Obama was the one who ordered this stuff out into the field. So what are we to make of all of this? How to make sense of it? Well, let's start by looking at Iran as a nuclear power. Now, when we say nuclear power, we generally mean a power possessing a nuclear weapon, but playing in the nuclear game is not just possessing nuclear weapons. Iran's ability to deal with nuclear technology goes all the way back to 1957, not coincidentally, the first year that Israel also gained nuclear technology, and from roughly the same sources. Because under the Eisenhower Items for Peace program, we began to educate Iranians and provide them with the necessary tools to understand quantum mechanics and fundamental 20th century physics, and all of that is intimately tied up with understanding nuclear energy. By 1967, 10 years later, we'd actually built, in cooperation with the Iranian regime, a research reactor, 5-megawatt reactor, and provided highly enriched uranium, HEU, which we continued to provide to fuel that reactor. So in Tehran, there's actually a nuclear reactor, US built, that had been running for a great many years. And in 1968, at our behest, the Iranian regime signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the NPT, as it's known, obligates signatories to allow the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to inspect and monitor all nuclear facilities, civilian and military. It's a transparency regime. You may remember that during the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan's famous admonition was that with the Russians, you trust but verify. And the verification part of that is the IAEA's job. They go in and make sure that nothing untoward is happening, that it's safe, and that this technology is not being diverted to non-peaceful means. Now, moving forward, in the 1970s, the Shah recognized that this precious petroleum resource that Iran sat on would someday run out. And so in cooperation with international authorities, both the US and in Europe, principally the French and the Germans, the Shah embarked on an ambitious plan to create electricity for the entire country of Iran by building and running 23 nuclear power plants. This is at the same time that France is also building in excess of 40 nuclear power plants. During the 1970s, we still believed that nuclear energy was this safe, clean alternative. You weren't, after all, digging up coal and burning it. You didn't have visible stuff from the smokestacks, and we were still a few years short of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. We also had, somewhat hubristically, a sense that we could deal with nuclear waste as a problem, that we could simply bury it and put it away for the several million years that it would take for it to cool off and become less dangerous. How far we've come, I'm not sure. In 1979, by 1979, in the time of the Iranian Revolution, the first of those nuclear reactors, power reactors at Bushehr, 2 units, 2 different reactors at the same place, were respectively 50 and 85% complete. And predictably, after the Iranian Revolution and the taking of the hostages, we, the French and the Germans, all declined to continue constructing the Bushehr plant. In 1980, during the hostage crisis, we said no more highly enriched uranium for the research reactor in Tehran. And without highly enriched uranium, that reactor design slowly ages out and eventually shuts down. The nuclear fire goes out. In the 1990s, however, Russia and China both provided materiel and expert assistance to the regime in order to try to complete Bushehr and do some other things. And by 2002, the Iranian regime was found to have begun a program to build a uranium enrichment facility at Natanz. Now, that facility initially was built out in the open. It was built above ground, and the stated goal of that facility was to enrich uranium so that the original plans for peaceful uses, medical, research, and power generation could move forward. In the period between 2002 and 2006, the Iranians conducted negotiations with the IAEA in Geneva, and the IAEA, in doing its inspections, reported that there were certain blind spots, that they were not permitted to inspect certain parts of the Iranian nuclear apparatus. And they started issuing a series of reports showing the failures of Iran to comply with its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And at this same time, through satellite surveillance, we began to notice a few things at Natanz. And that's the picture that you see down here. That's the Natanz site. What we noticed was that some of the buildings at Natanz had disappeared. and that instead it seemed that the site had been swept clear by bulldozers, but that huge power lines had been brought into the facility. So the buildings disappeared, but the power consumption was tremendous. We noticed that auxiliary buildings were still being built, roads were being built, there were still people there were still vehicles there. Where did the big buildings go? And the answer eventually became clear. They went 300 feet straight down into the ground. The Iranians had buried them. During 2009, a second uranium enrichment plant was announced by the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, at Fordow. And all during this period, the UN Security Council issued resolution after resolution, 8 in total, condemning Iran for its violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its failure to allow inspection regimes. Now, it's important for us to understand a little bit of the technology in order to understand why this is such a hot political issue. So let's go back to physics class for a few minutes. I apologize. I know that's not why you teach what you teach. If you dig uranium out of the ground, as they do at Natanz in Iran, what you get is mostly a stable form of uranium, an isotope called uranium-238. And less than 1% of what you dig out of the ground in that uranium is the unstable, what's called fissile form of uranium, uranium-235. That's the stuff that glows in the dark. That's the stuff you can use to power a reactor, and that's the stuff that you need to make a bomb. Now, the numbers, 238 and 235, refer to the atomic mass of this material. And if you divide one by the other, 238 by 235, what you find out is that the difference in the weight of two of these atoms is infinitesimal. So the question becomes, if I want the stuff that glows in the dark and not the garbage, how do I make that? And the answer is, I have to enrich it. I have to separate it. Think of having a container that contains one red marble for every 9,000 black marbles. How are you going to separate that? Well, you could sit there and laboriously go like this, and every once in a while you smile because you found the red one. But you've got to find a better way to do that. And we, and the Germans, by the way, during World War II, figured that out. And the way you do it is that you use the difference in weight between those two isotopes, and if you can find a way to make that difference in weight matter, you can separate them. And the way we do that is we take the uranium, which is, by this time, we've dug it out of the ground as a rock, we've crushed it up real good into something called yellow cake. It's a yellow powder. We then treat that with a very strong acid, and we make it into something called uranium hexafluoride. It's a gas. It's corrosive as hell, and it's really poisonous, but we do it anyway. And we take tons and tons of this uranium, and we make uranium hexafluoride, and then what we've got to do is spin it really fast in a centrifuge. Because when you do that, the heavier stuff flies to the outside, the lighter stuff stays on the inside. We've found a way to separate the 235 from the 238. And if we can do that enough, we can enrich from this 0.7% that we get out of the ground to between 3 and 4%, and that's reactor fuel. So if you're going to generate electrical power, spinning the uranium until you get 3 to 4% 235 in that mixture, and then reconverting it from the gas into a solid, into a pellet, gives you reactor fuel. Going above that to, say, 20% means that you have something that's usable in a weapon. Now, in this case, that's not a fission bomb. That's a dirty bomb. That's a conventional explosive that just takes this radioactive, poisonous material and spreads it all over. This is the stuff of movies. And if you can take it and spin it more to the point where you get over 85% fissile material, that's what we call bomb-grade or weapons-grade uranium. And that's the stuff that you can mold into a core and turn into a real nuclear weapon. And when we spin it, one of the things that we find is that you can't just put it in one of these centrifuges and keep spinning, because eventually, when you spin it, what you end up with is more waste than the stuff you really want, the uranium-238. And uranium-238, which has had the fissile material removed, is called depleted uranium. Now, that stuff is not totally useless. That's extremely heavy stuff, and it's really hard. When you reconvert that into a metal, that becomes armor-piercing tank shells and armor-piercing bullets that we fire from machine guns. So that's good stuff. But the stuff we really want is the stuff that glows in the dark, the 235. So how long does this process take? Well, if you can't spin it in one centrifuge, what you need is something called a centrifuge cascade. We spin it, and we take the stuff that becomes a little more 235, and we put it in another centrifuge, and we spin that, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so if we put all of these centrifuges together, many in parallel, many coming down in the cascade, what we find out is that we can create this uranium-235 and enrich it to 3 to 4% with about between 1,600 and 1,800 separate centrifuges working together in one place. So the pipes go from one to another to another to another, and this takes months. Because every time you put the stuff in the centrifuge and start to spin it, you've got to spin it for between 3 and 6 weeks at high speed before there's enough separation. And we express the efficiency of these centrifuges in something called a separation work unit. Now, our centrifuges in the United States, the stuff we use to make this material, are pretty efficient. But the centrifuges that Iran got from the AQ Khan network in Pakistan were called the P1 centrifuges. The Pakistanis stole the designs from the Dutch, built their own and gave those designs to people like Iran and Libya. Gaddafi was running centrifuge cascades. That centrifuge does 1.4, give or take, work units per month. They've got some new centrifuges that are much more efficient. And the difference is the materials of the centrifuge and how fast you can spin them. If the cylinder that spins is made out of aluminum, you can only spin it so fast before the metal cracks. If you make it out of carbon fiber, you can spin it faster. And if the centrifuge is this tall, you only get so much work, but if you double the height, you get more. And that's what they've been working on. Now, one bomb requires 25 kilograms of weapons-grade material, and we call that a significant quantity. All of these things are in the treaties, of course. And a significant quantity allows you to make one bomb. So one of the things you will read about is the question of breakout. And breakout means from where you are now, what's the minimum time that it would take to make one significant quantity? In other words, to make enough to make one bomb. And at present, the best estimates of the Iranian nuclear program from August are that breakout could occur in 6 weeks. 6 weeks to get enough material to build a bomb. Now, that's because you start with whatever enriched material you have, and you go absolutely hell-bent for leather to make that one 25-kilogram amount. In other words, you're willing to be inefficient. If you want to make 4 significant quantities, the estimate is it takes you longer. So if you want 4 bombs, 11 to 14 months to do that. But that's what we're talking about. That's what Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about when he stood at the podium at the General Assembly last month and held up that picture of a crude bomb with what he called a red line. The red line is, when do they have enough material to actually make a bomb and threaten people? And we do our best to do these estimates. to figure out what breakout time is. Now, that doesn't mean that they have a bomb, because making a nuclear weapon isn't as simple as just having the fissile material. You've also got to have a way to explode it. And what we know from long experience is that that's not as easy as it looks. That's not a Wile E. Coyote moment. And you have to have a way to deliver it, because these crude bombs, with all of the apparatus required to explode them, are quite heavy and quite large. And miniaturizing them is something that's extremely difficult. So they've got to have a way to get it where it needs to be. A missile, an airplane that can drop it, a container that it can go in on a ship, whatever. And we don't have good estimates on that for Iran. So that's what we talk about when we talk about the criticality, the red lines in the Iranian nuclear program. And for at least the last dozen years, the United States, and to greater and lesser extent, our allies, have been engaged in negotiations and sanctions regimes, all aimed at trying to slow, delay, or push back that red line. Now, there are some fringe elements in the West, I won't mention his name, Stephen Walt, who think that what we ought to do is just take off the brakes and let Iran have all the bombs it wants. That it would be a good thing, that it would be stabilizing. Obviously, I don't agree with that. I think that's akin to saying that we ought to give all criminals extra guns and bullets. But political theorists are not real people. Now, one of the things that we hear is, why can't we just go and bomb these operations? And what you're seeing here is pictures of something called Operation Orchard, carried out by the Israelis in 2007. This is, by most accounts, the first integrated cyber attack on record. You see, what happened was that the Syrians were building a nuclear reactor in northern Syria with the help of their friends, the North Koreans. And they got to a certain point where the Israelis considered this a threat. So what the Israelis did was first go in and disable the most sophisticated anti-aircraft missile system in the world, the one that the Syrians operated that had been given to them brand spanking new by the Russians. If the Syrian defense operators sitting in their control rooms had bothered to look out the window, they would have seen Israeli warplanes flying by at low level, armed to the teeth. But instead, they stared at their computer screens, which reported that all was well and quiet. Think of the scene in Mission Impossible, where Tom Cruise takes the Polaroid and tapes it up in front of the security camera. That's what the Israelis did with a computer virus. And then the airplanes, a very small contingent of them, because they didn't need all the defenders flying with them, flew in and took what had been a nuclear facility, a big square building, and that was the aftermath, because within a week or so, the Syrians simply brought in bulldozers and bulldozed the site clean. So, seems like a pretty good idea. If the Israelis can do that once, can't they do it again? Well, maybe not. You see, this is the real map of the Middle East. We can tell because, like, Egypt is way over there. And it is a frightfully long way from Israel to the many sites that are implicated in the nuclear program in Iran. You'd have to attack many sites simultaneously after flying long distances. And don't forget, this all has happened after Operation Orchard, and the Iranians are not stupid. Their sites are buried underground by 300 feet or dug into the side of a mountain. So it's not that easy, because the biggest bomb that the Israelis have, as you can see, might be capable of penetrating between 6 and 8 meters of the concrete that buries these sites. Now, we have been developing a new bomb called the Massive Ordnance, the MOB. And the MOB is really, really big. How big is it? Well, we had to pay $160 million to modify 2 B-2 bombers just so that each one of those bombers could carry one of these bombs. Now, they're big bombs. And as you can see, they're designed to get through about 60 to 70 meters of hardened concrete or mountainside before they explode. These are not nuclear. These are conventional. But the question is, how many times can you get lucky, fly over and drop one of these things? Remember, we only have 2 airplanes in the entire world that can carry them. And the Iranians have more than 2 sites, and each site is big enough that one bomb wouldn't take it out. And I think we can all agree that the last thing that the United States wants to do is drop a nuclear weapon on a nuclear site. That's not exactly smart. And so it is not all that easy to think about the military option here, even if you could blind all the air defenses, and even if, as we heard, the Iranian Air Force is a joke. You're still operating all the way around the other side of the world on the very edge of weapons technology without good assurance that you would do anything, and then comes the bad news. And the bad news is that once you have the nuclear genie out of the bottle, once the knowledge is there, even if we destroy these sites, they already know and have the plans and the resources to rebuild them, or rebuild them elsewhere where we can't find them. Now, I don't say we can't find them, we just couldn't find them easily. So the problem here is that the calculus is notoriously difficult. So we have turned to something a little different, cyber war. What is cyber war? Well, Deputy Defense Secretary William Lynn told us we don't know. And if he doesn't know, I'm sure a lot of people don't know. But cyber war, simply put, is the use of computers and computer networks and software to do what you would otherwise do in warfare with weapons. Pretty simple. Now, if we don't know what it is, how are we going to wage it? How are we going to defend against it? All good questions, no good answers. But it's coming. You see, in 1999, 2 colonels of the People's Liberation Army told us what cyber war was. They published a book on it. You can buy that book on Amazon. And what they told us was that you can use computers, software, and networks to do a variety of things that look like warfare. You can use computer viruses, worms, and Trojan horses to disable or change the way computers work. You can do what's called information poisoning. Information poisoning looks in its simplest form like I go online and I check my bank balance and it says I'm well-to-do. And tomorrow when I go online and check my bank balance, it says I'm less well-to-do. Not broke, mind you, because that might set off a flag. If you've ever checked your credit card statement and found a transaction that you didn't recognize, most likely that's just credit card fraud. But it could be information poisoning. And only your credit card company can tell, and sometimes that's hard for them. Financial manipulation would be just changing the information that financial markets depend upon. Because if one thing we know about financial markets is that they all depend on economists, and economists all start all sentences with the same statement. Let's assume we have perfect information about the market. Well, if the information isn't perfect, then what the economists tell us is wrong, then we make wrong guesses, we execute wrong trades, we price things incorrectly, and the capitalist world starts to doubt itself. And finally, direct cyber attack. We can go after the computers and the systems. So the Chinese told us this 13 years ago. No big surprise. So we know about it. Why don't we defend ourselves? And the answer is, we can't. No one can. There is no defensive posture in cyber war. During the Cold War, our defensive posture was called MAD. right? Mutually assured destruction. We said to the Russians, you may have a lot of nuclear weapons, you may get the first lick in, but enough of our nuclear weapons will survive, and we know where you live, we'll wipe you off the face of the earth in retaliation. And for more than 50 years, that Mexican standoff worked. The problem is that cyber weapons don't come with a return address. In cyber war, identifying who attacked you and where they are is often impossible, certainly impossible to do rapidly. How do we know this? Well, we can look at the history. Look back to August of 2003, when the Northeast United States, from eastern Ohio through right here, all the way to New York City and beyond, was blacked out on an August afternoon. 44 minutes after the blackout struck, the White House and the governor of New York simultaneously announced, no problem, folks, this is not terrorism. It took 17 months for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to issue a report that told us what it was. You might ask yourself, how did they know in 44 minutes? I have no answer for that. But what we do know is that a power line in eastern Ohio sagged, touched a tree, and started a cascade that the industry, at least, had assured us could never happen, that blacked out the eastern United States and cost us about $14 billion before we got it all fixed. What we also know is that that blackout was aided by the fact that on that very afternoon, something called the blaster worm was busy chewing its way through Windows computer networks at a mad rate. And while the worm itself didn't cause the blackout, what it did was keep the operators of the power grid from seeing the blackout progress, so they couldn't respond and stop it. And the only reason that blackout stopped just north of Philadelphia was a young man, 26 years old, sitting in a black office with a bunch of computer screens about 6 miles from where I live in Valley Forge, who made a lucky guess. He bet his career on flipping a switch. If he had been wrong about what he thought was going on, he would have killed the lights from Philadelphia to North Carolina and lost his job. It turns out he made the right guess. He had 15 seconds to make that guess. And as a result, Allentown, just to the north of Philadelphia, was blacked out for 3 days, and Philadelphia and south survived with the power left on. So we just don't have defenses that work. Now, the systems that are most vulnerable to attack are called SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Systems. These are little computers that you guys never see. What do? They run traffic lights. They run water production and wastewater systems. They run elevators. They run lights and heating and air conditioning in buildings. They run railroad switches. They run the air traffic control system. They run industrial plants of all kinds. And these systems were basically designed in the 1980s before we even had a whiff of a thought about security, before we'd thought about cyber war. And they can't be retrofit to make them secure for the most part. We've got to rip them out by the roots and replace them with new ones. You can imagine how the mayor of a big city would respond if I went to him and said, Mr. Mayor, you know all those traffic lights? You know all the sewers under your streets and the water systems under your streets? You know all the lights in the buildings that the city operates? They're all run by little computers, and you're going to have to replace those computers to the tune of, let's say, $4 billion. When he stopped laughing, I'd be shown out of his office immediately. It just isn't going to happen. Why are we worried about this? Well, according to the Department of Homeland Security, the worry is not that these computer systems get destroyed, but rather that the computer systems that control our lives and our industrial capacity do the wrong thing at the wrong time, and that this has really catastrophic consequences. Now, bear in mind, this is not new news. We've known about this for a long time. So why am I talking about it in a symposium on Iran? This is why. Because beginning about 3 years ago, we started a campaign that uses all of these vulnerabilities as a weapon. We went after the Iranian nuclear program with something that came to be known as Stuxnet. Now, it wasn't called that by the people who designed it. That's a word that appears in the code deeply embedded and encrypted. The security researchers who found this thing and took it apart to understand it found that word, and it stuck. Stuxnet was also, we now know, a project of the US and Israeli governments codenamed Olympic Games. There you see President Ahmadinejad standing among those tall cylinders, and those are P1 centrifuges at Natanz in Iran. Each one of those cylinders spins at high speed containing uranium hexafluoride, and as you look down the row, you are seeing a centrifuge cascade intended to enrich uranium way beyond 3 to 4% needed for power reactors, way beyond the 20% that is usable for weapons, all the way to weapons grade at 85+%. Why do we know that? Because we know, according to the IAEA and pronouncements of the Iranian government, that they built more than 10,000 centrifuges. And given the number of reactors that they have and that they plan, if they were only going for reactor fuel for medical and power purposes, they would have needed about 1,600 centrifuges. So what do we know about Stuxnet? Well, we know that sometime in mid-2008, give or take, this thing was released to the internet, and that in May 2010, independent, non-government people found it floating around there on the internet. It was this strange-looking worm that attacked computer systems, but they didn't know what it did, and they didn't know what it was intended to do. Allegedly, there was a mistake that allowed this worm to spread on the internet. I'm not sure I fully believe that, but that's the excuse that was given and published in the New York Times. The first thing that we know, however, is that certain types of computer hardware that are subject to restrictions, they're not supposed to be sent or sold to Iran, made their way to Iran anyway. These pieces of computer hardware are specialized industrial controllers. And those industrial controllers, we think, were purchased on the black market from companies in Taiwan. Now, I have reason to believe that that is true, and furthermore, I have reason to believe that the companies in Taiwan were either set up and operated or at least influenced strongly by certain agencies of the United States government. And those computer controllers that made their way to Iran were already poisoned with some secret computer code. And the purpose of that computer code was at some point to wake up and say to the internet, here I am, this is where I ended up. They were a beacon. Now, those things also contained some code that would allow them to steal some rudimentary information about where they were and what they were connected to. And that information, in turn, was relayed outside of Iran. Now, in addition to that, the Stuxnet code itself made its way onto computers at the Natanz facility. We don't exactly know how, but we think by using those little USB memory sticks that you all are so familiar with. Because there are ways of engineering those little memory sticks so that you don't have to do anything other than plug them into your computer, and then I got you. Now, those memory sticks used security certificates that were stolen from 2 Taiwanese companies. Those are electronic signatures that say, I'm cool, I'm good, you should let me in the door. And in addition, they used something called 0 days. A 0 day is a type of attack on a computer which has never been seen before, never been documented, and therefore cannot be defended against. A 0 day attack is among the most valuable things to a hacker. In fact, if you know where to look and know where to ask, you can actually buy a documented 0 day attack for Windows. They cost about $100,000. You can buy them on the internet. Now, they are so valuable that we have never ever seen a computer virus that used more than 1 0 day. And yet Stuxnet used 4 simultaneously, all in an effort to ensure that this bad code would make its way past any defenses onto these computers. Once it made its way onto the computers with the USB sticks, then it just looks around the network. Says, are there any other computers here? And then it hops from computer to computer. And by the way, it also hops through your keyboard. It also hops through printers. It's pretty clever. And it just worms its way through the entire network. And as it does so, it creates for itself a map of all of the devices connected to all the networks. It encodes all of that map, and then it was programmed to phone home like ET. Except that instead of phoning home like ET, it actually dialed up 2 different websites, one in Malaysia and one in Denmark, both of which had URLs that seemed to be about FIFA World Football, soccer to us. So they were pretty innocuous. And it would call up this website, seemingly asking what the scores were in the game, but embedded in that request for the score was the entire map of the computer network on which it sat. It phoned home to these computers. Now, we don't know who ran these computers. They're long since gone. We don't know who registered those domains. There's no record of it. It's pretty cloak and dagger. And it specifically targeted Natanz. How do we know that? Well, a little bit of surmise. You see, the Stuxnet worm is coded to attack only one specific configuration of computers in the entire world. It has to attack a Siemens Cymatic controller. That's a controller that only controls industrial processes. And that controller has to be connected to a specific kind of communication network called a Profibus. And in turn, the Profibus has to be connected to 33 devices called frequency converter drives. And frequency converter drives of only 2 types, one manufactured in Finland and one manufactured in Iran itself. And those frequency converter drives control the speed of a motor. And what we think is that the motor sits at the base of each one of those P1 centrifuges, making it spin. And if you don't match that fingerprint of a network, the virus deletes itself. Says this isn't the right one, goes away completely, doesn't bother you. But if you match that network, if you look like that target, then this thing is pretty clever, because it hijacks lots of different pieces of software within the computer and hides itself. How does it hide itself? Well, the first thing it does is go into these industrial controllers and save the computer program that was originally there in a separate little piece of memory. Then it substitutes new computer programming. That's the worm. Now, the cool part is that it saves the original program for a very good reason. A function that I call the nope, nobody in here but us chickens routine. Because if, after it infects the controller, an operator comes along and says, hey, tell me what you're doing. What are you running? The infected software sees that request, goes and gets the original software and sends it back. Like, we're cool. Nobody in here but us chickens. And the operator never sees the corrupted program. Now, it does this, and it continually modified itself, and this is what it does after it infects. Every 15 minutes or so, it goes out and it looks around and makes sure that it's infected all of the controllers in the network. And once it has, it then sits there and watches these frequency converter drives for a signal that says that the motor is running between 810 and 1210 revolutions per minute, or hertz. Because that's the speed that you run a P1 centrifuge when you're separating uranium. So when it finds it gets up to speed, then what does it do? Well, it takes a snooze. It goes to sleep for about 13 days, give or take. Why? Because we know that the centrifuge is going to be working for weeks to separate the uranium. Then, it waits for that period of time and subtly speeds up the centrifuge to 1,410 revolutions per minute. And then, after running it for a certain period of time at that speed, it slams on the brakes and slows the centrifuge to 2 revolutions per minute. And then it does that a while, just whacks it back and forth a bit. And then it goes to sleep and waits for 26 days and does it all over again. Why? Why does it do all this? Well, for a P1 centrifuge, we know that the aluminum rotor fails, cracks, if you run it too fast, and 1410 seems to be the too fast. We also know that there are built-in safety systems in these centrifuges. So if you slam on the brakes in a centrifuge, it's going to do its safety routine. And the first safety routine it does is it opens up a valve and vacuums all of the uranium hexafluoride out and throws it away. So here we are, we've been making this batch, we've been making our cookies for 13 days to 26 days. It's getting to the point where it might have enough in it. We slam on the brakes, garbage. We just threw the cookies on the floor. And then if you slam on the brakes really hard a couple of times, you break the bearings that hold the centrifuge in place. And what we know is that Iran built more than 10,000 centrifuges, but at one point, fewer than 3,700 of them were still working. Now imagine, you're seeing all this go on. So the first thing you do as an operator in the Natanz facility is you say to the computers, show me what's going on. And the no chickens in here routine says, we're cool, no problem. So the next response of the Iranians was they took these guys, who normally sit above ground in nice air-conditioned buildings, they gave them each a chair and they said, go sit down there with all the centrifuges, watch them. Now that's really loud and ugly, kind of unventilated. And remember, this worm sits there and goes to sleep for 13 days and then 26 days. Nothing happens. So these guys are just sitting down there waiting for something to break. And of course, the timing is not coincident, right? These are centrifuge cascades. There are 10,000 of these, and one of them breaks every so often. It literally took them years to figure out they were even under attack and that they didn't have some fundamental engineering flaw in the motors or the bearings or some other component. After all, they'd built all this stuff under sanctions regimes. They had to buy it on the black market. And remember, all the while, they're using equipment that was pre-poisoned with other bad stuff. So the question for your students becomes, who did this? Well, we know the answer, but this is kind of a neat detective game. Because in January of 2011, the New York Times published a story that Israel had tested something, but the people who took apart the computer code noticed 2 interesting things in that code. Now, this is some of the most sophisticated computer code ever written. The first thing they noticed was this number, 1979-0509. If you're a computer person, you know that that's the 9th of May, 1979. That's how we write it. And if you're a student of Iranian history, you understand that that is the date on which a prominent Iranian Jew was executed publicly in Tehran after the revolution. We also found this string of seemingly a file name in the code, which contained the green words myrtus and guava. Now, guava, we know, is a type of fruit. What we may not know, if you're not a botanist, is that it's part of the myrtle family. And if you're not a student of biblical history and you don't know the book of Esther, then you probably don't know that the name Esther translates to myrtle. And the book of Esther is the story of the queen of the king of Persia, Ahasuerus, who saved the Jews of Iran from the evil plot of the prime minister Haman. At this point, we're all supposed to make noise if you're on Purim. So here are these clues. Now, they can only mean a couple of things, right? Thing one, this cyber weapon is Israeli in origin. Now, bear in mind, the people who wrote this were among the most sophisticated programmers in the world. why would they leave this stuff floating around in the computer code? So there must be another explanation. And that other explanation is that somebody else did it and intentionally put this in the code to make us believe it was the Israelis. But being intelligence, there's a third possibility, and that is that the Israelis did it and put this stuff in the code to make us believe that somebody else put it in the code so we'd believe it was the Israelis. What we do know is that the P1 centrifuges that were owned by Gaddafi after he decided to give up his nuclear ambitions came to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and were tested and characterized and then stored there, and that the Idaho National Lab had cooperated with Siemens to test all of its controllers and computers. Clues. Oop. It went up. Yes, it's a computer bug. There we go. Turns out all that was right. See, we did it. We now know, based on published reports, that this was in fact a joint US-Israeli program called Olympic Games. We know that it was developed by the National Security Agency and a unit of the Israeli Defense Forces called Unit 8200. Now, interestingly, Unit 8200 was set up by an Israeli general, the head of the IDF, named Amos Yadlin, whose prior claim to fame is that he led the raid that destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak back in the 80s. So this is a guy who knows what he's talking about when it comes to destroying nuclear facilities. And according to an anonymous US official, it turns out there's always an idiot around who doesn't think much about the thumb drive in their hand. People will just plug these things into their computers willy-nilly. And as I said, we got you. So what are we to learn about the future now that we understand what cyber war has done? Well, by most estimates, this attack set the Iranian nuclear program back between 2.5 and 4 years. Far more than an actual bomb attack might have. We now have a map of all of these computer networks, both in Iran and outside. And that's like a fingerprint that allows us to fire a guided cyber missile anywhere we want. We know that there are derivations of the Stuxnet code that will become useful, and that these derivations will be combined with things called botnets that'll just kind of lurk out there on the internet waiting for new networks to pop up so that they can be attacked. And we've already seen that. Because in October of last year, 1 year ago, we found something called DQ on the internet. You can see the countries, God bless, that have been infected with DQ. Right now, all that DQ does is go in and steal information from computers and phone home. We don't know to where. But we also know from analyzing the code that the people who wrote DQ don't seem to have worked Friday night through Saturday night Jerusalem time. That's all we know about it. And we also know that it doesn't require you to do anything because all you have to do is visit a website or open a Word document and DQ owns your computer. You don't have to say okay, you don't have to click, you don't have to open an email. So it's a silent attack. It works through a particular font embedded in a file. Microsoft patched that back in May. So if you're up to date with your Microsoft software, you don't have to worry. It only attacks Windows. Not bad. How many people actually update their computers in the world? And the answer is that 60% of the Windows computers in the world are not updated. 20% of them can't be updated. They run pirated versions of software that's too old to update. This is like I told you there was a pandemic coming and 60% of your fellow citizens refused to be vaccinated. You wouldn't feel too good about it. And now we've seen something called Flame, also called Skywiper. Founded in May. This one's a totally directed attacker, and it has the capability not only of stealing all of the important files on a computer and sending them somewhere, It can also turn on the microphone and listen to what's going on around the computer and record your Skype conversations. So it can actually listen to you and you won't know it. And again, these are the places where it has been located. It requires a specific directed attack. It doesn't spread on the internet. And this is how it spreads: through networks, through USB sticks, through printers, and so forth. Flame talks phones home to over 80 different servers around the world, and they are constantly moving. It is most worryingly written to specifically evade 263 different antivirus programs. So it has a nobody but in here but us chickens routine. If you're running antivirus, if you're running Symantec, Norton, Kaspersky, all of those, it specifically not only informs those programs that it's cool, it also disables the ability of those programs to update themselves to remove the flame from the computer. So we're talking very sophisticated code. And lastly, if you try to mess with it, it activates something called the wiper, Browse 32, which completely obliterates your computer system, overwrites every file on your hard disk with random information. Now, what we were told when this first came out is that there would be some blowback. There would be some boomerangs, and we have seen that. Just this summer, something called Shamoon showed up on the internet. Again, the people who wrote it didn't call it Shamoon. This is a word that appears in the code. And Shamoon managed, in the middle of August, to steal a bunch of files and then destroy 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco on the eve of a major Islamic holiday. So nobody was in the office. At 11:04 in the morning, everyone went out, all these computers. Took them weeks to replace all the hard drives because, like the other things, if you try to remove Shamoon from the computer, it completely overwrites the ability of the computer to operate. In this case, it destroys something called the master boot record. Razgas at Qatar was also attacked, and what we now know is that this was an insider attack. It was spread by a USB key. Someone who was trusted came in on that holiday and plugged it into one of the computers in the network, and it spread from there. So just when you thought that it was safe to control your network by putting a firewall around it, by disconnecting from the internet, remember that the greatest threat is insiders. More recently, we have seen direct attacks by Iran, by a group called the Qassam cyber fighters, on US banks. They have disabled the websites and the online banking capability at a number of major banks with something called a distributed denial of service attack. This one is pretty ham-handed. All they did was download a hacker toolkit from the internet called "It's Okay, No Problem, Bro." But that's a new hacker toolkit which has the ability to flood a web server at 70 gigabits per second. That's 700 times faster than your internet connections at home if you've got cable. It just slows them. It's like running in molasses until the server crashes. Now you combine all of this with the other side of the story that I'm sure your students will like to hear, but it's not pretty, and that is, and I apologize for the small type, but this is the extent of it, from January of 2010 through January of 2012, a number of key individuals, both nuclear scientists and computer scientists in Iran, have found themselves on the receiving end of some rather nasty messages, most of which have been magnetically attached bombs, where an unknown individual rides through the traffic in Tehran, slaps it on the side of the victim's car, rides away on his motorcycle, and the bomb blows. So anytime you think it's safe just to be a scientist in your lab, think again. When the Stuxnet virus first attacked, Iran put out a call on the internet offering $500,000 to computer security experts who would come and help wipe it out. Someone put out something on the internet that said, "We don't think your life is worth $500,000, and no one took up the offer. Finally, there has been a follow-up cyber attack. In July of this year, remember all those guys sitting on chairs downstairs in the in the halls with all of the cascades, all of a sudden, in the very middle of the night, what happened? Every computer in the building began playing AC/DC. Not coincidentally, the major part of the soundtrack of the movie Iron Man, remember the guy who uses technology to enforce world peace? And we haven't traced the source of that one either. So is it war? Well, somebody from our Pentagon told the Wall Street Journal, and this is a quote, "If you shut down our power grid, maybe we'll put a missile down one of your smokestacks." And on one of the hacker boards that I monitor, that's the response. Lols, we have 0 smokestacks, dude. Again, we don't know where these guys live. So for the future, all future wars, declared and undeclared, hot or not, will contain cyber components. Security technologies playing defense doesn't work. Deterrence, mutually assured destruction, doesn't work. It's a new world. It's a cyber world. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. We'll open it up for questions.
It's been fun seeing how we're on the offensive end of this. Can you give us any insight how China is doing this against us?
China is doing this against us in both more and less sophisticated ways. Every single day, our infrastructure, our power grid, our dams, our water systems, and so forth, are probed electronically millions of times by computers located in mainland China. But more than that, the Chinese are experts at simply sweeping together information which is in the open, seemingly valueless and disconnected information. And so every single day, multiple gigabytes of public domain information are swept across the sea to China, where there are organizations dedicated to fitting all of the pieces back together in order to develop not only intelligence, but intellectual property espionage. One of the things that we learn when we study cyber war is that there are really no differences among cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime, and cyber espionage. It's all a matter of what your objective is. And so we are hit by China intentionally. They have a cyber war unit, but this more often goes on in what they call engineering schools. Rooms, buildings full of students who are being trained to hack, to pull information, to hit systems, not always with the objective of shutting those systems down and blowing stuff up, but often with the objective of probing us to figure out where the weaknesses are. And then if you add to that the fact that in this country, for instance, we no longer manufacture microprocessors or memory chips. Almost all of that comes from the Far East. And we have no idea what is buried in those chips. The situation gets pretty dire pretty quickly.
Paul Dickler.
Thank you, Lawrence. Early in your talk, you made a reference to 6 weeks. Now, you didn't say whether you were talking 6 weeks from August or 6 weeks from right now. I presumed you meant 6 weeks from the present.
Well, the 6 weeks, the 1.4 months, is the August best estimate of the most rapid process that the Iranians could use to produce one significant quantity, 25 kilograms, of bomb-grade material. That doesn't mean they have a bomb, right. It's just that material. And so that's the most recent estimate that I was able to source.
So in light of everything you said, and knowing that Netanyahu also knows most of what you just said,
far more.
Probably more, would you try to hazard a guess at his red line UN speech and what the likely intent of that speech was?
Well, clearly it has been said many times that the Israelis have a red line which is different from ours. If you simply look at the difference in weapons capability, right, we know that we have the mob, the massive ordnance, and the B-2s that fly it, and Netanyahu does not. And so he has less ability to mount a successful kinetic strike, and he's also the stated close target of a potential nuclear weapon. And so he knows all of this, and when he stands at the UN with the diagram of the bomb with a red line, what he's telling us is things are going to get more rapidly paced and more dire for Israel long before the rest of the world thinks we've hit a critical point of no return. And that Israel may be forced to take an action under what we heard yesterday, the mowing the grass scenario, right? You mow it, you don't know what weeds may pop up after, but at least you've mowed it once. This is the scenario that Israel employed at Osirak. This is the scenario that Israel employed in Operation Orchard. There's no reason to believe that the Israelis have changed doctrine in the interim. In spite of all the other information. I don't know. I just don't know enough because my research is entirely on the open source side. I do not have a security clearance. I do not want one. I think they carry with them more downside than upside. And so what I can deduce from looking at the open source information is that we're in a very precarious situation, that Israel may in fact feel itself existentially threatened far earlier than anyone estimates.
David Noblet from North Carolina.
Hi, Lawrence. I just wanted to point out to you and to everyone else, today's Pittsburgh Tribune front page story is about how hackers are being recruited as mercenaries for both overseas companies, organized crime interests, and, of course, shady entities, which are countries, mostly Russians, but a lot of Americans, a lot of Chinese. Google's offering $100 to fix their security breaches, and some of these places are offering these guys six-figure incomes to exploit security breaches. So
Absolutely.
Interesting article for anybody who's interested.
And in addition to that, thank you for that. In September, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, held a preliminary meeting for U.S. companies interested in bidding on contracts to manage and design the next generation of offensive cyber weapons for the U.S. government. And many companies showed up. This is a concerted effort to make sure that we have lots of different organizations designing these capabilities, because if we can't have a great defense, the thought is we should have a better offense.
Okay, David DeNaples from Connecticut.
Hello, and thank you. Many hackers, I would imagine there's far more hackers outside of the world of intelligence and virus spreaders who are sitting in their basements doing what they do for the sake of doing what they do. As talented as they are in that realm, is there potential that some of these individuals could spread a virus, hack a system without understanding the centrifuge side of things and actually cause real damage in terms of security and the threat of world peace?
Well, the answer, I think, in microcosm, is found in an incident, a pair of incidents that occurred about 4 months ago. A hacker decided that the Department of Homeland Security was not taking critical infrastructure security and cybersecurity seriously enough. And so he reprogrammed a pump at a water authority in Illinois to blow itself up. Literally shake itself to death. And then, after he did this, he documented exactly what he had done in an open letter to the Department of Homeland Security, which roundly ignored him. So he did it on a larger scale, but not a life-threatening scale, in Texas. And this time, the FBI went after him. My opinion, exactly the wrong response. This guy may have committed a criminal act of vandalism. I happen to believe we should have recruited him. and we still don't take the problem seriously. So the answer is, are they going to do it without understanding it? Unlikely. Hackers deeply understand the systems they affect. Are they going to do it for the sake of doing it? Well, hell, that's the definition of a teenager.
And on that note, we'll bring this to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And I will leave this up for a little while. This is what you are supposed to do if you find yourself needing to travel overseas carrying a computer. I realize that this is completely absurd, but people who routinely travel to China know that they should not take computers with them. They don't even take their real cell phones with them. And the reason is that as soon as you set foot there, they will hack you. And this is true of many countries. It's been true for a very long time. But this is the kind of precaution that professionals are telling us to take. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. I think Lawrence has a unique ability to explain very complex material in crystal clear manner. So we thank you, Lawrence, for that. We'll take a short 10-minute break. We're on schedule now to break up this conference a half hour early so everyone can get their flights or wherever they have to go. Thank you.